This video is part of Project Africa, a collaboration of over 25 history YouTubers. More info on that at the end of the program. If you go to the British Museum on any given day, you might run into Augustus. Well, not him, but a sculpture of his head. Though technically he never claimed the title, Augustus is considered to be the first emperor of the Roman Empire. This particular head is one of many thousands of artifacts that make up the museum's extensive collection. However, this particular artifact has a really interesting story, for it wasn't found in the city of Rome, the Italian peninsula, Europe, or even within the confines of what was once the Roman Empire. It was found amongst the ruins of the ancient city of Meroe, located today in what is modern Sudan. That's right, in Sudan, in the middle of what today is a sparsely populated desert. Of course, Meroe wasn't always like this. It was once the capital of one of the most incredible empires of the ancient world, one that is often skipped in many world history books, or at best, overshadowed by its ancient neighbor to the north, Egypt. It's kind of a shame, because the great civilization and empire that Meroe was once the center of had a tremendous impact on our world today. The civilization I'm referring to is that of ancient Nubia and the Kingdom of Kush. So without further ado, let's begin. Let's take a look at this place we call Nubia. First, let's clarify the term. Nubia defines a geographic region that's located in the northeast corner of Africa. Today, this region would encompass the southern end of Egypt and the northern half of modern Sudan. Running through the center of it is the Great Nile River. Nubia is generally broken up into two parts according to the direction that the Nile flows. Lower Nubia is in the north, while Upper Nubia is in the south. This at first is a bit confusing, but keep in mind, for the Nubians as well as the Egyptians, their north was the direction from where the source of the Nile was, not the Mediterranean Sea, where it emptied out. Upper Nubia was also the heartland of the Kingdom of Kush. The Nile itself is divided by a series of rapids called cataracts, which have throughout time served as natural boundaries for different regions within Nubia. These cataracts formed when the river ran into outcrops of hard rock, forming a system of unnavigable rapids. The first cataract, at Aswan, is where Nubia begins. The last one, the sixth cataract, is just north of the modern Sudanese capital of Khartoum. So where does the name Nubia come from? Many believe that it's derived from the word nub, which means gold in the ancient Egyptian language. Others believe that the name comes from tribes that settled there called the Nuba or Noba. However, perhaps a more common name for this region was Taseti, meaning land of the bow, due to the region's highly skilled archers. Nubian can also be an ambiguous term. As a people, the ancient Nubians weren't made up of a single group. In fact, they were extremely diverse, with different ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, languages, and even religious beliefs. Since the earliest historical records that mention it, Nubia and Kush had been tied, for better or worse, to the land of Egypt. In fact, most of our information about ancient Nubia and Kush come from Egyptian sources. This can be a bit problematic, not because Egyptians weren't good at recording history, but because Egypt and the peoples of Nubia were great rivals. Due to this, there may be, and often are, biases in Egyptian accounts of their interactions with the Nubian people, which is another thing that we should be aware of. Nubia has been occupied since the earliest periods of human history. It's almost impossible to know for sure just how far this habitation goes back, but by around 13,000 BCE, the Nubians were quite advanced, and we know this because there is a lot of evidence of complex tools, arrowheads, and even cemeteries that have been found all over Nubia. By 5000 BCE, we start to see the people of this region begin to transition into a more settled life consisting of farming and animal husbandry. Buildings and houses were being built of mud brick and stone instead of straw, and copper and gold were commonly being used for tools and luxury items such as jewelry. In fact, gold seems to have been in ample supply in Nubia, and for mainly this reason, the Egyptians became interested in the place. The first time that we hear of an Egyptian incursion into Nubia is during the reign of the Egyptian pharaoh Djejer. In an inscription from around 3000 BCE and dating to Egypt's first dynasty, we're told that the pharaoh's forces came into conflict with and defeated a band of Nubians. Another mention of conflict with the Nubians is on the famous Palermo stone, which is part of a stele that records the names and deeds of Egypt's Old Kingdom pharaohs. It tells how the pharaoh Senefru took 7,000 Nubians as prisoner, along with 200,000 cattle and sheep. By the 4th and 5th dynasties of Egypt, or around 2500 to 2400 BCE, there were well-established Egyptian colonies in Nubia by the Second Cataract, mostly for mining and smelting gold and copper. The early dynasties of Egypt did their best to avoid large-scale conflicts in Nubia. This was due to several reasons. One was that the people of Nubia were known to be fiercely independent and hard to control. They also recognized that a stable, commercially viable Nubia was in everyone's best interests. Therefore, as long as trade between the two lands flowed without interruption, the pharaohs were, for the most part, willing to abandon any plans of annexing lands south of the Second Cataract. However, by around 2100 BCE, things had changed. Though it's unclear as to what was the initial cause, armed conflicts between groups of Nubians and Egyptian forces were a constant occurrence. Details are murky, but Egypt must have felt threatened because the pharaohs built a string of fortresses with massive walls in between the Second and Third Cataracts. But why? What had caused this total reversal of policy and seemed to be so threatening to Egypt? The answer may have been the rise of a new Nubian power just beyond the Third Cataract of the Nile, the city of Kerma. From what we know, the city of Kerma was likely established around the year 2400 BCE. Its location just south of the Third Cataract had two distinct advantages. One was that to get there from Egypt, ships had to first unload and go ashore if they wanted to continue down the Nile further into Africa. So, if you were an invading army from Egypt, you couldn't simply sail all the way to Kerma. You'd have to unload your troops and any supplies before you hit the Third Cataract, or else be destroyed by its fierce rapids and sharp rocks. If you were a commercial or trading vessel, you had to do the same with your crew and any cargo. However, once you were beyond the Third Cataract, you'd need a place to rest, recharge, and probably resupply your ship. And that's where Kerma came in. Not only could merchants rest, recharge, and resupply, but Kerma also provided a market for traders coming from the north to exchange goods with those who lived further south down the Nile. Thus, the city's location provided both defense and potential for profit, making it a great base for a flourishing kingdom. Many scholars call this kingdom the first Kingdom of Kush. By around 1850 BCE, Kerma's influence had grown so much that it was a direct threat to Egypt. According to an inscription found at the Egyptian site of El Kab, Nubians attacked and looted the city, carrying off alabaster vases, copper daggers, statues, and other valuable items. In response, the Egyptians launched a punitive expedition into Nubia, but the damage to Egyptian prestige had already been done. The fact that Nubians could launch such brazen attacks well above the Second Cataract was great cause for alarm. There wasn't much, though, that the pharaoh could do. In northern, or lower Egypt, he was under attack by a people from Western Asia called the Hyksos, who eventually went on to establish their own dynasty and rule much of Egypt for about 75 years. Towards the end of their reign, the Hyksos attempted to create an alliance with the kings of Kerma. What stood between their capital of Avaris and Kerma was Kamose, who ruled from Thebes the Egyptian territories that were not controlled by the Hyksos. After intercepting correspondence between Kerma and Avaris, Kamose attacked Nubian forces and captured territories and former Egyptian outposts up to the second cataract of the Nile. He then raced to Avaris to attack the Hyksos, but was defeated. However, his brother, who became Ahmose I and founded the 18th dynasty of Egypt, finished what Kamose had started by defeating the Hyksos and chasing them out of Egypt once and for all. He then turned his gaze south towards Nubia. Up until that time, the Egyptians had little interest in expanding their territory and becoming an empire. However, the Hyksos invasion and rule of their land had changed all of that. Unlike in the past, where the Egyptians were primarily interested in commerce and reluctant to rule Nubia directly, Ahmose and his successors decided that it was in Egypt's best long-term interest to control Nubia outright. Thus, he launched numerous campaigns in the south with the intention of annexing Nubia and making it part of a new Egyptian empire. For nearly 90 years, the two sides fought, but by 1460 BCE, Egypt had finally conquered all of Nubia, including the Kingdom of Kush based at Kerma. Kerma still remained a prosperous city during the years of Egyptian occupation. However, another city, Napata, was on the rise. Though its origins aren't exactly known, some say it was founded by the pharaoh Thutmose III, while others say that it already existed before he arrived there, there's no doubt that Napata became an extremely important Nubian city during the New Kingdom period of Egypt. Regardless of its beginnings, Napata was without a doubt influenced by Egyptian culture. Pharaoh Thutmose III had built a great temple to the god Amun there below the nearby mountain known as Jebel Barkal, which would eventually become the most holy religious site in Kush for much of its history. During what's become known as the Third Intermediate Period, Egypt became fractured politically. The opportunity arose for the Nubians to once again gain control of their country. It was a clan from the city of Napata that would become the most powerful in Nubia and usher in its greatest period of prosperity, not to mention rule over Egypt. The first real Nubian king that we have historical records for is Olara. There were kings before Olara, but their names aren't known, only the record that they existed. Olara, who was born in the city of Sanam, came to power around the year 785 BCE and ruled for 20 years. It's difficult to confirm what he was doing during that time, but it's likely that he consolidated his rule in Upper Nubia at least up to the Third Cataract, which would have included Kerma. In 765 BCE, his brother, Kashta, succeeded him. Kashta pushed Kush's borders beyond Nubia and into Egypt. He captured the city of Thebes and put his daughter, Amanirdis, in the position of wife of the god of Amun, which was essentially the equivalent of high priestess of Egypt. This move is considered by many scholars to be even more important than any military victories because it helped to legitimize Kushite claims over Upper Egypt. Kashta then declared himself to be the pharaoh. However, Lower Egypt remained outside of his control. That region was conquered by Kashta's brother and successor, Pianki, better known as Piye. Towards the end of his reign, Piye and his generals campaigned in Upper Egypt and the Nile Delta region against all who wouldn't submit to his authority. He allowed many of the princes who opposed him in the Nile Delta region to keep their positions as long as they pledged their allegiance to him and vowed not to take up arms against his government. With their promises given, Piye returned to Napata. The Delta princes, however, reneged their agreements with Piye and rebelled. After Piye passed away in 722 BCE, his younger brother Shabak came to power. He lived during interesting times. First, Shabak had to deal with rebel princes in the Delta region. Whereas Piye had offered mercy, Shabak offered fire, literally. The rebel ringleader, a prince from the preceding 24th dynasty named Bakenranef, had been one of those who had pledged his loyalty to Piye, only to break his oath and rebel. As punishment, when Shabak captured him, he burned him alive. Then, there was the looming threat of Assyria. Starting during Piye's reign and continuing into Shabak's, Egypt's Nubian pharaohs formed alliances with the Kingdom of Judah as well as various Phoenician city-states. The next king, Shabataka, also had the Assyrian threat to deal with. Like his predecessor, he maintained strong ties and alliances with the free kingdoms of Canaan and the Levant. To aid his allies, he sent men with his younger brother Taharka to assist the forces of King Hezekiah of Judah, as well as King Luli of the Phoenician city-states of Tyre and Sidon. They were getting ready to face the Assyrian armies of King Sennacherib. While the Phoenicians didn't fare so well, Hezekiah and the city of Jerusalem held their ground, and the Assyrians were forced to withdraw back east to their homeland. For now, the Assyrian threat was gone, but they'd no doubt be back in the future. The years in battle had given Taharka valuable experience in combating the Assyrians, as well as strengthening ties with the Kushite dynasty's allies in the east. In 690 BCE, Taharka became the pharaoh of Egypt and Kush. Upon Sennacherib's assassination, his son, Esarhaddon, ascended the throne of Assyria and returned to Canaan. Taharka once again aided revolts in the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon, but to no avail. Esarhaddon crushed the revolts and in 673 BCE invaded Egypt. He met Taharka's forces at Tanis, but the army of the Kushite king was no match for Esarhaddon's more advanced military technology and camel cavalry, something that the Egyptians had never seen before. Despite his defeats, Taharka fought on, supporting his Phoenician and Judean allies, as well as retaking the Delta. Around the year 667 or 666 BCE, Ashurbanipal invaded Egypt, retook the Delta, the city of Memphis, and then made his way to Thebes, sacking all of these areas in the process. By now, though, there was little that Taharka could do, and so heartbroken, he ventured back to Napata. Though still king of Kush, Taharka was a broken man and died shortly afterward in the year 664 BCE. Despite his defeat, Taharka was an extremely well-liked pharaoh, and by any measure, a pretty good ruler and leader in terms of how he treated his people and those around him. He was also a great builder and left many monuments to his name. He lived a really fascinating life, and there are more details to his story which I'll no doubt cover in the sequels to this program. Despite the fact that eventually the Assyrian Empire lost control of Egypt and was conquered by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, the Kushite kings of Napata never really attempted to reclaim the thrones of Thebes or Memphis. In fact, they were often on the defensive. In 591 BCE, the new Egyptian pharaoh, Psamtik II, launched a full invasion of Kush. Not only did he have Egyptian troops, but also used Greek and Carian mercenaries to supplement his already large army. His forces were able to venture deep into the heart of Nubia, well past the Third Cataract, and finally, capture the Kushite capital of Napata itself. It was shortly after this event, and most likely because of it, that in the year 590 BCE, the Kushite capital was moved to the city of Meroe, which was much further down the Nile between the 5th and 6th cataracts. For the next few hundred years until the kingdom's fall, Meroe would be the official capital and residence of the kings of Kush. Napata still remained an important center of Kushite culture, and for many decades, kings were still buried in the royal cemeteries on its outskirts. But for all practical purposes, Meroe was the administrative capital of the empire. Meroe was a beautiful city known for its palaces, temples, and gardens filled with fruit trees. It was also at the junction of where traders from the Red Sea, Ethiopia, and sub-Saharan Africa would often meet. And land there was much better suited for farming than in the area around Napata. The Kushites began the process of breaking away culturally from Egypt. Over time, more distinctly Nubian gods and goddesses were worshipped over Egyptian ones. And in the 2nd century BCE, the use of Egyptian hieroglyphics was replaced with an entirely new Meroitic writing system. Even their artwork and style of dress took on the indigenous characteristics of Meroe and the nearby region. This of course made sense, as the Kushite court's proximity to Egypt was now much farther away. There were still battles with the Egyptians for Lower Nubia to the north, especially during the time after Alexander the Great's successors in Egypt, specifically the Macedonian general Ptolemy and his successors. These battles with the Ptolemies went on for a couple of centuries, with both sides gaining and losing ground, but not making substantial long-term gains on each other. Then came the Romans. In the year 30 BCE, the Romans under Octavian, who later went by the title Augustus Caesar, or simply Augustus, overthrew the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, Cleopatra VII. The Romans then annexed Egypt, making it a province of their empire. This changed the balance of power in the region because, unlike Egypt under the Ptolemies, Rome was a powerful and vast empire that essentially encompassed the entire Mediterranean world and large parts of Europe. And it was expanding. The Romans knew that Nubia was rich in valuable metals and other resources, which put it on their radar. Like Egyptian rulers of the past, they also thought that they could demand tribute from Nubia's rulers. Initially, the Kushites did agree to pay the Romans a tribute in order to keep them out of Nubia. Fearing though that Rome was preparing a full-scale invasion, the Kushites under their great queen, Amenarenes, invaded Egypt and seized Egyptian towns, reportedly all the way up to Thebes. One thing that I want to mention here, in Nubian society, it wasn't uncommon for rulers to be female. Not only this, but Kushite queens, called Kandakes, or as the term has been Latinized to Candace, were known to have been great warriors. Amenarenes was such a queen. For about 5 years, she personally led her armies against Roman positions in Lower Nubia, taking captured Roman soldiers and many treasures from Egypt back to Meroe. Among the treasures Amenarenes' troops brought back was a larger-than-life bronze head of Augustus. The head of Augustus at Meroe was eventually put under the staircase leading up to the altar of the Victory Temple. Another story is that the head was actually put at the foot of Queen Amenarenes' throne. I had read somewhere that this symbolized that the Romans would always be under the feet of the Kushites. In 25 BCE, the Roman governor of Egypt, General Petronius, counterattacked by leading a large Roman force deep into Nubia. He arrived at the great city of Napata and burned it. He then marched onward to Meroe, but ultimately could not make it to the capital, possibly due to the fact that the Kushite defenses of Meroe were quite strong. Thus, he garrisoned his men on a fortified ridge that would allow them to hold out until reinforcements arrived. The Kushites, though they would be able to deflect a Roman advance on Meroe, did not have the manpower to dislodge the Romans from their fortified position, at least not without a great cost in lives and resources. Thus, the conflict turned into a stalemate. Wanting the Romans to leave before they could be reinforced, in 22 BCE, Queen Amenarenes sent envoys to the island of Samos to negotiate a treaty with Augustus. The final agreement was as such. The Kushites would pay the same tribute to the Romans that they'd agreed to before the war, as well as recompensate the Egyptian cities that they'd attacked. In return, the Romans would leave and hand back all of the Nubian territories that they'd captured from the Kushites. Essentially, things went back to the way that they'd been before the start of the war. Of course, Augustus's head still remained in Meroe. That wouldn't leave the city until 1910, when an archaeological expedition to Meroe would dig it up and bring it back to London, where it lies today in the British Museum. During the next few centuries, not much is known about the Kushite Empire other than a few clashes with both Romans and African tribes. Around the year 300, though, the Romans left, and the parts of Nubia that they once controlled were ruled and governed by indigenous tribes. There was also a new, growing power to the south, the Kingdom of Aksum, in what is today Ethiopia. How the Kushite kingdom came to an end is still debated by scholars. The popular theory is that in the year 330, the Aksumites captured the city of Meroe and absorbed the surrounding area, effectively ending the Kingdom of Kush. Others, though, believe that the decline was much more gradual, with perhaps the Kushites being defeated by another tribe, the Nuba. What is known is that by 330, the Kingdom of Kush was no more. For over 1,000 years, the kingdom, really Empire of Kush, had reigned supreme in Nubia. Whether from Kerma, Napata, or Meroe, the Kushites were a constant force to be reckoned with. Despite sharing a great deal with their neighbors, the Egyptians, the Kushites had an original civilization of their own and remained profoundly African until the end. So, if you didn't before, I hope that you have a better idea of the fascinating and glorious history of the Kingdom of Kush. This was just an introduction. There's a lot more to their story that I'll be discussing in future episodes, so please make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, be sure to check out Voices of the Past's video on Hanno the Navigator, and from from Nothing's video on Ghana, Susu, Mali, and the Songhai empires. Also check out the other great videos in the Project Africa collaboration. The link to the playlist is in the video description. Thanks a lot and have an awesome day.